Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
Gavin and Melissa lived in Greenville, a mid-sized town in South Carolina where almost everyone knew each other or at least crossed paths regularly at the same markets, churches, and diners. Married for nearly 10 years, they were the kind of couple that gave others a sense of calm, the rare type who seemed to have found a quiet balance between routine and affection, between closeness and personal space. Gavin worked as a human resources supervisor at an automotive parts company with branches across the state. He was respected by his co-workers, admired by management, and known for maintaining an ethical stance in every decision, even the toughest ones. Melissa, on the other hand, worked as a senior analyst at a job agency that connected professionals with major regional industries. She was efficient, personable, and highly sought after by companies that trusted her sharp eye when recommending new talent. Their marriage was built on a solid routine, but not a boring one. They attended the same church every Sunday, traveled often during long holidays, and kept the habit of going out to dinner at least twice a month. Close friends often said they looked like a couple who met young and never let their affection fade. They laughed at inside jokes, exchanged sweet messages during work hours, and made it a point to attend family and social events together. There were no notable arguments or long disputes. The differences that came up over time were settled through conversation and a kind of patience that only grows when there's mutual respect. It was a relationship built on strong foundations, seemingly immune to crises. But there was one delicate issue between them that, while it didn't cause direct conflict, was always present as an unfulfilled desire. Gavin had always dreamed of being a father. From the early years of their relationship, he'd talk with a sparkle in his eye about having kids, teaching them to ride a bike, giving advice during their teenage years, experiencing fatherhood as the most meaningful phase of adult life. But after a series of tests and failed attempts, they discovered Gavin was infertile. The news settled over the couple like a silent cloud. They tried treatments, inseminations, even considered donor options but eventually backed out. With each new cycle ending in disappointment, Gavin allowed himself a quiet sadness he never fully expressed. Melissa, meanwhile, always showed support. She researched clinics, scheduled appointments, took the necessary tests, and maintained an optimistic attitude in the face of setbacks. But what Gavin never knew was that her desire to have children didn't come from her heart, but was instead a way of supporting her husband's dream, of giving him what she imagined would make him truly happy. It wasn't a lie, nor manipulation. It was a silent compromise, a quiet adaptation of love. Melissa never voiced this lack of desire. On the contrary, after every failed attempt, she was the one comforting him, saying maybe it was just a matter of time or that perhaps destiny had other plans for them. Still, the marriage continued without major disruptions. Gavin never let frustration take over and continued treating Melissa with the same care and dedication as always. He made small gestures, like preparing breakfast on Sundays, planning short trips to break up the routine, and surprising her with flowers on random dates. Melissa responded with attention to detail, notes left in his wallet, carefully prepared lunches, subtle touches of affection amid the daily rush. To everyone who knew them, they were a stable, loving couple, above any suspicion. Over the months, Gavin began noticing that Melissa was bringing home new things more often. First, it was a delicate gold necklace with a pendant he'd never seen before. Then, a new phone, a recent model, the kind that required a significant investment. When he asked casually, Melissa said she'd received a special bonus at work, recognition for a successful hiring campaign. Gavin, always trusting, celebrated with her, saying she deserved it. It never crossed his mind that anything might be wrong. This was the woman he'd chosen to share his life with. The idea of suspicion simply didn't fit how he saw the world. Time passed, and the gifts kept coming. A designer handbag, a weekend at a spa she'd booked, and then one day Melissa announced she'd put a down payment on a new car, a price that surprised Gavin. Again, she explained she'd combined part of her bonus with some savings and would finance the rest in small monthly payments. Gavin congratulated her, praised her organizational skills, and even mentioned it to coworkers, saying how proud he felt of his wife. To him, all of this was a direct reflection of her professional effort. He never considered any other possibility. And so, between short trips, church commitments, regular workdays, and quiet nights watching movies on the couch, the couple's life moved forward. No visible signs of crisis. No suspicious behavior. No out-of-place comments. Gavin lived with the certainty that his relationship was one of the few that had stood the test of time without cracks. What he didn't yet know was that, while he took pride in the stability they'd built together, something much bigger was already happening just outside the reality he believed he controlled. But he wouldn't find out until later. Much later. That Friday seemed to follow the same rhythm as any other. Gavin had wrapped up his workweek feeling accomplished, organizing reports, answering emails, already making weekend plans. His phone rang mid-afternoon as he was leaving the office and heading to the grocery store. It was a familiar number, but one that rarely called him directly. Aaron, a friend from church, one of those quiet, serious guys who only called when something important came up. Gavin answered casually, expecting maybe an invitation to a meeting or a request for help with something at the congregation. But on the other end, the voice sounded tense, rushed, like someone trying to gather thoughts in the middle of chaos. He simply said Gavin needed to go immediately to a specific restaurant in Spartanburg, a neighboring town about 20 minutes away. He didn't explain why, just insisted it was urgent, that it couldn't wait. The urgency in Aaron's tone left no room for doubt. Gavin, even though he didn't understand, trusted him too much to question it. He got in his car without going home and drove in silence, his mind trying to figure out what could be happening. He thought about some issue with someone from church, something involving fundraising, or maybe even an accident. But it never occurred to him what he was actually about to find. Arriving at the restaurant Aaron mentioned, a quiet place with outdoor tables under a dark awning, Gavin parked, looked around, and searched for Aaron. He didn't see him. He walked in slowly, scanning the room. Then he stopped. At one of the farthest tables, in a corner where natural light cast partial shadows, sat Melissa and the church pastor. They weren't hugging or touching, but there was something unmistakable in that moment. The way she smiled, the way he looked at her, the way their bodies leaned toward each other. This wasn't a pastoral conversation. It was intimacy. It was closeness. It was the kind of connection you recognize from a distance. Gavin froze for 2 seconds. His heart instantly raced, as if it had been yanked out of his chest. Melissa didn't see him right away, but the pastor did. He straightened up, looked down, then at her, and whispered something that made Melissa turn around. When their eyes met, her face drained of color in seconds. Her smile vanished, her shoulders dropped, and her expression collapsed into panic. Gavin, without looking away, walked to the table. He didn't say a word. He just pulled out a chair and sat down across from them. The silence in that moment was almost suffocating. The waiter passed by in the background but didn't come closer. The voices from other tables sounded distant, muffled by a bubble of tension that had formed between the three of them. Melissa froze. Eyes wide, her hand trembling as she still held the menu. The pastor, visibly shaken, kept avoiding eye contact, like he wanted to disappear. Gavin stopped in front of the table, jaw clenched. His voice came out low, controlled, but full of tension. "What is this?" Neither of them answered. Gavin slowly pulled out the chair and sat down, never taking his eyes off his wife. His hands rested firmly on the table. "I'm only going to ask once more, Melissa. What's going on?" She wiped her hand across her forehead, trying to steady her voice. "Gavin, please, just listen to me. Get straight to the point." Melissa swallowed hard. Her eyes filled with tears. I'm involved with him." The words dropped like stones. Gavin closed his eyes for a second, taking a deep breath, as if trying to hold back something about to explode. The pastor shifted in his seat. "Don't say a word," Gavin cut in, pointing at him without even looking. "I'm talking to my wife." "I didn't want it to happen like this," she went on, trying to justify herself. "It started in a confusing way. I was feeling fragile, and he—" "Are you seriously trying to tell me this was an accident?" She didn't answer. She just lowered her eyes. "How long?" "A few months." Gavin looked away, bit his lower lip. He stayed silent for a few seconds. Then he turned back to face her. "Why?" Melissa hesitated. Tried to form words, but only stammered. "I don't know. I felt alone, lost, we were drifting apart, and you decided to get close to the one guy who knew everything about us," Gavin interrupted, sarcastic. "The pastor. How convenient." She took a deep breath. "I tried to stop. But I couldn't. It just kept getting stronger." "Stronger?" Gavin repeated, with a humorless smile. "You know what else was strong? The trust one had in you." Melissa started crying. The pastor tried to explain. "Gavin, I'm sorry too. I didn't plan this." Gavin stood up. He looked at both of them like they were complete strangers. "I'm not staying here to hear a sermon from a cheater. And you, Melissa, it's over. You betrayed me with the one man you never should have." She reached out to grab his arm. "Please, don't leave like this." Gavin gently but firmly pulled his arm away. His eyes said it all. "This marriage died the moment you two decided to play with my faith." He took a step back, looked at them one last time, and walked out of the restaurant, leaving behind a silence heavier than any words could have been. As soon as Gavin left the restaurant, Aaron's phone rang. It was him, saying only that he'd seen enough, that he didn't need further explanations. Aaron, who had already suspected something from the pastor's recent behavior, had been there the whole time, watching from a distance. He'd seen the hug, the touch on the face, the silent smiles, the exchanged glances that, to anyone with sense, screamed intimacy. He was shocked when he saw Gavin approach and sit down, but stayed quiet, respecting his friend's space and mentally recording every detail. The next day, Aaron went to the church leadership. With a steady voice and a heavy gaze, he told them exactly what he'd witnessed. He reported previous suspicious meetings, confirmed the affair wasn't speculation, and said, unfortunately, it had all been confirmed right before his eyes. The news spread like lightning through the congregation. Within hours, the church leaders knew about the scandal. They held an emergency meeting, called the pastor in for a talk, and despite his weak attempts to explain, the decision was immediate: he was removed from his position, with no timeline for return. There was no room for emotional speeches or tearful apologies. What weighed most wasn't just the marital betrayal, but something even worse. During the internal investigation, they discovered the pastor had used part of the church's donation money, offerings and tithes, to buy expensive gifts for Melissa. Jewelry, imported perfumes, discreet trips. All paid for with the sacred money from the community. When confronted, Melissa tried to deny it at first. But the evidence was clear: receipts, bank statements, transaction records directly linking the misused funds to her name. Faced with the threat of being reported to the police, both she and the pastor agreed to cooperate. A formal agreement was made with the church leadership. Both returned all the money in full, item by item, cent by cent. Melissa had to give up designer handbags, clothes, electronics, and even a diamond necklace. The humiliation was obvious, but necessary. The congregation was divided between shock and anger. Many members, some of them struggling financially, had given sacrificially, believing they were supporting God's work. They felt deeply betrayed. It wasn't just spiritual disappointment, it was a violation. The figure of the pastor, who once stood at the pulpit with a firm voice and tearful eyes, was now seen as a fraud. His name was removed from the leaders' board. The office he used was emptied. And his chair remained empty at the next service, where only silence seemed to have authority. The pastor's wife, devastated, found out through one of the church leaders. They chose to tell her carefully, so she wouldn't hear it from someone else. She stayed silent for hours, unsure how to react. Their 3 children, aged 10 to 17, sensed the heavy atmosphere at home and slowly began to understand what had happened. The church's support was immediate. Members took turns helping her with the kids, brought ready-made meals, offered rides to activities, and, more than anything, offered emotional support to this woman who had nothing to do with her husband's mistakes. She didn't cry in public, but everyone knew she was falling apart inside. The pastor, after being officially removed, left town in silence. He didn't announce his destination or leave an address. He just disappeared. Meanwhile, Melissa faced a reality she wasn't ready to handle. She left Gavin's house the same day he asked her to, taking only the essentials. She spent a few days in a hotel, then moved temporarily to her sister's place in a nearby town. She didn't keep in touch with anyone from church or try to justify herself. She was ashamed, withdrawn, like someone who no longer knew how to exist in the world. She started avoiding going out, turning down invitations, living in a self-imposed silence. There was no defense. The affair with a spiritual leader had broken more than a marriage, it had also severed every tie with the community that once embraced her. At church, some members tried to understand how all of this happened right under their noses. Others preferred not to talk about it. But what became clear to everyone was how truly Gavin had been victimized. A man who had always dedicated himself to his marriage, seen as a model of integrity and commitment, was now dealing with the pain of being betrayed not just by his wife, but by someone he respected as a spiritual leader. For many, that was the hardest part to accept. That's why the support for him wasn't just symbolic. It was genuine, constant, and came in many different forms. Over the months, Gavin began to reorganize his life more intentionally. There was no rush, no expectation to forget what happened, but there was a sincere desire to find his peace again. He returned firmly to his work routine, dove into reports, led important projects, and stayed busy with what he always did well. The office became a quiet refuge, a place where he could maintain control over at least one part of his life. Lunches with coworkers became more frequent again, and conversations slowly shifted from sympathy to real-life topics. Gavin listened, shared opinions, smiled faintly when he felt like it. He was reserved, but present. Still, there was a void that wouldn't go away. A silent space that resisted every attempt to fill it. The dream of being a father, though it had been put on hold, had never truly disappeared. It wasn't a whim or an obsession. It was a quiet calling, an old desire to share love, care, and values with someone who needed it. For a long time, he thought fatherhood could only happen within a stable marriage. But now, with the wreckage of what had been his life with her, he began to see the subject in a new light. It was on an ordinary night, sitting on the couch with his laptop on his lap, that he first searched for information about single-person adoption. He read personal stories, watched interviews, looked up official websites. He learned that while the process was long and demanding, real possibilities existed. He felt a mix of hesitation and excitement. He didn't know if he was ready, but he knew he needed to take a step forward. He started picturing himself reading bedtime stories, teaching simple lessons, packing school lunches. It wasn't exactly the fatherhood he once dreamed of, but it was real, possible, and full of meaning. Over time, the idea took shape. He contacted an agency, set up a meeting, received initial guidance. He began gathering documents, re-evaluating his living space, thinking about the changes he'd need to make it home. He was afraid, of course. But for the first time since his marriage ended, he also felt excitement. Like something inside him was finally coming back to life. Gavin's story didn't end with betrayal or pain. It ended with a choice. the choice not to let a wound define the rest of his life. By starting the adoption process, he wasn't just chasing an old dream, he was also finding a new reason to love, to build, to keep moving forward. The home he was rebuilding wasn't made of just walls and furniture. It was made of self-love, purpose, and a fresh start. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.